I'm Fred Martin. In 2026, I had the privilege of interviewing Luther Bergeland in Broomfield, Colorado. I do articles and presentations on veterans, aviators, and pioneers. Luther was referred to me by Dave Rogers at the Foothills Kiwanis Club. It is becoming a rare opportunity to work with World War II veterans. Luther is one of 3 100-year-old World War II veterans I've interviewed in the last couple years. His experiences as soldier, Army chaplain, and pastor extend from World War II through Korea and the Vietnam era, then decades as Lutheran pastor in Boulder, Colorado. We wrote and published an article about Luther in the April issue of Veterans Life magazine. It's published right here on the Front Range. Luther told me the article portrayed the spirit of his experiences, yet it was limited in length and didn't capture the broader historical scope of his story. That is why I'm creating this video. He experienced epic things in world history. His story is larger than even his own recollections. Luther said his is the story of a Minnesota farm boy drafted into the Army in late 1944. He was sent to Camp Wolters, Texas, for infantry basic training. After basic, he was sent overseas on a Liberty ship with hundreds of fellow seasick soldiers, Luther said. Arriving in Le Havre, France, they were loaded into 40x8s, railroad boxcars that reputedly held 40 troops and 8 mules, and then sent to the front. He was assigned to the 106th Infantry Division, which was being reconstituted after being decimated in the Christmas 1944 Battle of the Bulge. That was the Nazis' last vicious offensive assault before being driven back across the Rhine into Germany. This is in Belgium at the German border. Luther arrives just at the end of the battle. Now, let's look at the historical context of where Luther had just landed. In this brutal winter, the Germans had tried to attack into the salient of the American offensive line. This is the Bulge the battle was named for. Their objective was to break through and recapture the port of Antwerp. Hitler hoped against all odds that he could thus reclaim the German initiative. It was a tragic surprise for the Allies. American troops were surrounded at Bastogne. By the time Luther arrived in theater, the Allies had lost 19,276 killed, 62,489 wounded, and 26,612 captured. Luther was in the replacement forces. His memoirs are modest about arriving at the end of the Battle of the Bulge, but he was thrust into the pursuit of German forces across the Siegfried Line and the Rhine River. The Germans did not go easily. These were Germany's most formidable defenses, and German resistance was fierce. As an artilleryman, Luther operated 105mm guns. He drove 2.5-ton trucks and the M8 armored reconnaissance vehicle. Now comes the central theme of Luther's story, the focus of his article in Veterans Life. In his memoir, Luther succinctly writes of things he will never forget, including the devastatingly destructive power of the 88mm gun fired in a flat trajectory from a German Tiger tank. Luther then described the terrible night that was a pivotal moment in his life. Now, he had been baptized in the Lutheran Church, but in high school he drew away from the church. It was a time of rebellion for me, he said, yet his parents had been wise not to force church on him, instead letting the Holy Spirit guide him on his own way. That's good advice, I think, for most Christian parents. But that night in Germany, under Tiger tank fire, he was lonely, very scared, and felt totally lost. Luther said it was as though God reached out and welcomed a prodigal home. He made the promise that if God got him through that awful night, he would try to serve him the rest of his life. Later, Luther realized this was a parallel experience to the famous story of Martin Luther in 1505, caught in a violent thunderstorm. Martin Luther was in school to satisfy his father's wishes that he become a lawyer when, in an instant on the road home, lightning and dread of dying changed the course of his life. Heaven had overpowered him, and he cried out to St. Anne, "Save me, and I will become a monk." Martin Luther became a great reformer in Christianity for those who believe that God's salvation comes only through the gift of God to believers, not by anything humans can do to earn it. Luther Bergeland's battlefield vow would change the rest of his life, but the ministry would have to wait. The war in Europe ends May 8, 1945. Luther is spared the march into Berlin. Conditions there were horrible. Hitler had drafted the elderly and, most tragically, young children to stand the last fanatical defense of the city. But World War II was still raging in the Pacific. Luther was ordered to Marseille by boxcar to be shipped to the Far East, most likely to the invasion of the Japanese home island. After the Battle of Okinawa in April 1945, with over 14,000 American deaths, command upped the projections for U.S. casualties in the invasion of Japan to 1 million. Luther is spared again, this time by the bomb. He said, "We were all shocked by the devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but some of us have reason to be less judgmental about the use of the bombs. Our infantry division was slated to go to Japan for the planned invasion. The bomb was good news for us, and we were most happy to return to the occupation of Germany." A myth of history about post-World War II Germany is that the Allies liberated everyone and then they lived happily ever after. But post-war Germany was a place of devastation and upheaval, a nearly destroyed civilization. It was split into 4 occupation zones. Luther saw destitute German civilians scavenge through trash. He recalls an elderly man in a threadbare suit and tie as he stood weeping beside a garbage can, crying, "Kaputt, alles kaputt, all is lost, all is gone." Luther was assigned to the processing of hundreds of German prisoners. Concertina wire was unspooled by machines to build enclosures for prisoners. Some they placed in old German barracks, some lived outside. So much had been destroyed. Some prisoners were so young, many were elderly. Most had been drafted and were thankful war was over. Many acted pro-American. Yet there were also hundreds of SS prisoners. Luther remembers the contempt in their cold, steel-blue eyes that seemed almost demonic. He had to disarm an SS officer of his Luger. He tried to refuse to give it up, seeming to glare at me, Luther said. "You little farm kid." My buddy pointed a gun at his head. I took the pistol from his hand. Luther also did searches of German houses looking for contraband, and he processed many Polish and Russian refugees who had been slave laborers in Germany.
Germany at the end of the Second World War. Millions of refugees and displaced people from the East search for new homes in the West. Every second house has been destroyed. Every farmer is required to accommodate refugees on his land. Emergency accommodation is set up in all 4 occupied zones. Even former concentration camps are used as emergency shelters.
A good many of the refugees were afraid to return home. Both the Germans and Russians had been brutal to the Polish, and the Polish in turn sought vengeance on both. They did not know what they would find or what to expect in their homeland. Panic worsened in this processing, and Luther said, "We loaded them at gunpoint into trucks. One heavy old woman, dressed in black, hurled herself off a moving truck and was instantly killed on the cobblestones. That was awfully sad." He cried over it. Luther attended the Nuremberg trials. He said, "The men in the dock, wearing their soiled Nazi uniforms, Hess, Göring, and the rest, they look like a sad, broken lot. I particularly recall the old fat guy. That was Hermann Göring, commander of the Nazi Luftwaffe, a right-hand man of Hitler. At trial, he denied his role in the Holocaust, though he had been one of the architects of those horrors. Göring escaped the gallows by suicide. Luther left Germany July 1946. He sailed into New York Harbor and cheered at the sight of the Statue of Liberty alongside thousands of other GIs. He was discharged from the Army that summer at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. Well, he came home to that oath he had made under fire that winter night on the German battlefield. He said, "Of course I regretted that oath that was made, I thought, under a bit of duress, many times. I had envisioned a life in company management, yet it seemed I was set on a path that never changed. At the time, the idea of a lifetime of service that I had promised equated with becoming a pastor, and so my path was set in that direction." Remembering that he had that promise to keep, Luther enrolled in Augsburg College in Minneapolis with the GI Bill. He took a liking to Greek, thought of teaching it, and he became employed by Aunt Anna, Sister Anna Bergeland, administrator at Lutheran Deaconess Hospital. He received training as a surgery orderly that would serve him later on, again in battle, handing surgeons hammers, saws, chisels used in their craft, changing casts, scrubbing floors. Then, on a cold winter morning on a campus sidewalk, Luther met Lois Warner. Tall, beautiful, elegant, gracious, bright and meticulous, Luther said. We stopped for a moment to talk. Their conversations continued for nearly 65 years. Luther said that after Germany he had a touch of PTSD. Lois lifted him from the mess he felt he was in and made him whole. Luther went on to Luther Seminary in St. Paul. In the course of those 3 years, one day he attended a meeting in chapel by a missionary, Berner Christensen, who said, "We must become part of the suffering of the age." Well, that phrase stuck with Luther, perhaps as a means of engaging with and transforming the suffering of others. It had already been in the back of his mind to re-enlist in the Army as a chaplain. He was ordained in June 1952 and nearly simultaneously commissioned as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army. Now, in doing this presentation, it is occurring to me that the proper noun Luther dominates this narrative from more than one angle. Martin and Amanda Bergeland, Luther's parents, named him, of course. They also named their youngest boy Martin Jr. In name choice alone, it's safe to assume these are devout Lutheran Minnesota farm folk. The names Martin and Luther, and my own last name fits in here, can be combined into Martin Luther, who was that 16th century Christian reformer who promised in that thunderstorm that he'd become a monk rather than a lawyer. Luther Seminary is, of course, named after Martin Luther, as is the Lutheran Church at large, which currently has about 110 million adherents worldwide. There's a Christian belief, as stated in Revelation and elsewhere in the Bible, that our names were written in the book of life before the foundations of the earth were laid down. Now, in light of that, it intrigues me to consider that of 8 children, Martin and Amanda bestowed the name Luther on the one baby destined to become a Lutheran minister. So I'm glad to clear up all that confusion. During several short stateside postings, the Bergelands married in 1949, had their first child living in Army guest housing. When the assignment to Korea came, Lois was again pregnant. Luther was conflicted about leaving a 9-month-old baby and pregnant wife behind. He had a short assignment in Yokohama, then joined the legendary 3rd Infantry Division, known as the Fire Brigade. He arrived in Korea the winter of 1952. Here is a picture of Luther in a field worship service in Korea. Among Luther's poignant recollections of Korea was assisting the battalion surgeon in desperate situations. He recalls helping with tracheotomies on the dirt floor of the battalion aid station. Soldiers with serious mouth and jaw wounds were in danger of suffocating in their own blood. Medics cut a breathing hole so victims might make it by helicopter to the nearest MASH unit. The early MASH Bell helicopter ambulance used in Korea is iconic for many viewers of the television show. Luther recalls soldiers in the aid station with tags over their beds with SIW. It meant self-inflicted wound. He was concerned that might prejudice the parity of triage and treatment decisions. SIW soldiers had been executed in earlier wars for cowardice. An Italian-American youngster from the Bronx was brought into the aid station after having just suffered the total amputations of both arms and legs. He wore a black and white rosary that was now almost as long as he was. Luther said, "We prayed together the 23rd Psalm, and I improvised the service of last rites for him. He could not survive. I held him like a baby as he died. It stays with me how little a man's body weighs when he has no arms or legs." In July 1953, Luther was in the Battle of Kum Song, one of the last major clashes of the war. He was in the MLR force, the main line of resistance. Chinese forces, with clear superiority in firepower, launched their attack along a 22-kilometer front known as the Kum Song Salient, a bulge similar to the World War II Battle of the Bulge, in the front lines held by South Korean forces. As Luther's battalion tried to advance, South Korean soldiers were retreating back through their lines. It was absolute chaos, Luther recalls, and then there were 9 Chinese divisions coming at us. On the way to battle, in a worship service, Chaplain Bergeland quoted Jeffrey Studdert Kennedy, famous English Anglican priest and poet of World War I, telling the men, "I am addressing dying men as a dying man." Kennedy is known for his quote, "It's better to do and die than to reason why." Here I am using scenes from a motion picture about the Battle of Kum Song. It's titled The Sacrifice. It was produced in China in 2022. It reflects a very important point. In America, Korea is often referred to as the Forgotten War. Not in China or North Korea. This film, made just 4 years ago, 73 years after the battle, proves that this history is fully alive in the memory of the Chinese and North Koreans and reflects their continued future aspirations. Korea is by no means a settled conflict in the 21st century. It is not pro-American, of course. American pilots are not flatteringly portrayed. Advancing with the MLR, at one point, to clear the road, Luther reluctantly unhitched a trailer from his vehicle and shoved it over the edge of the road with organ and other ministerial supplies. The Chinese proclaimed their victory in this battle then and in this recent film. Yet the operation only penetrated about 6 miles against the American and South Korean lines, and the Chinese suffered nearly 28,000 casualties. When the armistice was signed shortly after, they had to give up their gains back to the DMZ that is still the line today. This movie, The Sacrifice, centers on the wooden Kumsong River Bridge that was repeatedly destroyed by American bombing and yet rebuilt each time to the amazement of U.S. command. For his service at Kum Song, Luther Bergeland was awarded the Bronze Star. The Bronze Star Medal is the fourth highest ranking award a service member can receive for heroic and meritorious deeds performed in armed conflict. For those who receive the Bronze Star, it recognizes their sacrifice, bravery, and honor while serving their country. In Korea, Luther interacted with John Eisenhower, an intelligence officer, the son of General and President Dwight Eisenhower. A few years later, as a reservist chaplain at Denver Fitzsimmons Army Hospital, Luther dropped into Dwight Eisenhower's hospital room after his heart attack for a chat. Luther returned from Korea to a second child he hadn't yet met. Two more were still to come. His Army Reserve duty spanned 30 more years, including all of the Vietnam period. For some years, he was the mobilization designee to the 6th Army chaplain at the Presidio in San Francisco and assisted in running the school there. Luther has been called to witness many facets of war on many battlefields. As well, he ministered to many of the repercussions of war on the home front. He was division chaplain of the Ohio National Guard just weeks after the Kent State shootings. He said, "That was a tough assignment. Ohio Guard members had been involved. Vietnam was taking its toll all across America." Luther was stationed at Fort Sam Houston Army Hospital Burn Center. As it had been in Korea, he once again was on the front lines of the wounds and suffering of war, assisting, ministering. He had regular weekly assignments at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver as notification officer, going to the homes of families to inform them their son or husband had been killed in action in Vietnam. 620 Coloradoans were killed in Vietnam. "We went in a team of 2 on in-person visits," Luther explained. "No prior letters or phone calls. When they saw our staff car approaching, they knew." He recalls a visit to a farm east of Denver that was a typical experience. A mother was already hysterical as we drove up. She dropped to the ground, beating her head in the dirt. Still, I had to hold her and tell her that yes, her son had died. "Nothing I ever did in my life was more difficult," Luther said. We must become part of the suffering of the age. Luther had been inspired by these words back in seminary. He faced these challenges many times. In 1980, at age 55, came Luther's mandatory retirement from the Army. Luther says, "I never really left the military. For the next 25 years, I lived in both civilian and military worlds and did concurrent ministries in both. The values of duty, honor, and country appealed to my instincts, and I always wore the uniform with pride. In 2 wars, I served in combat in the infantry, field artillery, military police, and chaplain corps." Luther was promoted through the ranks to captain, major, and served 14 years in the rank of lieutenant colonel. In another major chapter of his life, Luther was pastor of Atonement Lutheran Church in Boulder, Colorado for 26 years. He led the development of this church that is at the center of community and campus ministry. And he has been an active member of the Military Officers Association of America. The MOA Admiral Arleigh Burke chapter meets monthly right there at Atonement Church. Now, it was an interesting twist for me working with Luther, is that he recently told me he saw my presentation about my father in the Himalayan hump operation there at MOA about 5 years ago. Reflecting back on that night under fire in Germany 82 years ago, Pastor Bergeland says, "I sometimes thought I should not have made that promise to God because I didn't feel adequate. Yet it has been an honor to serve God, family, and country for 80 years and to be a pastor, counselor, and spiritual guide to thousands of people." Indeed, he was saved that night on that German battlefield for a life that has benefited thousands. Those multitudes included 4 children, 10 grandchildren, and 18 great-grandchildren. They are among the many who owe so much to Luther's faithfulness.